For thousands of years, the human relationship with the sky was defined by a single, unchanging truth. It was a void. To the ancients, it was a canvas for gods and constellations. To the early pioneers of the Cold War, it was a terrifying, empty frontier where victory was measured in a single, metallic beep from a basketball-sized sphere. When President Dwight Eisenhower's voice was first bounced off the Echo 1 balloon in 1960, the experiment was hailed as a miracle. But by modern standards, it was a crude, desperate shout into an ocean of silence. Back then, if you wanted to see the world from above, you didn't check a live feed on your phone. You launched a Corona Spy satellite, a machine that functioned more like a flying disposable camera than a modern computer. It would snap its photos on physical reels of film, then literally eject a lead canister into the atmosphere. To get that data, a specialized Air Force plane had to fly at high altitudes and catch that falling canister in a giant scoop net midair. It took weeks of processing just to see a grainy image of a single shipyard. The sky was a place where we went to visit, briefly, and at immense cost. It was a wasteland we passed through. But look up tonight, and that truth has been annihilated. The empty sky is dead. In its place, we are witnessing the industrialization of the heavens, a transition so rapid and so profound that our legal and social structures haven't even begun to process the consequences. Since 2019, the number of satellites circling our planet hasn't just grown, it has more than doubled. We have moved from a few hundred government-funded relics to nearly 10,000 active machines, with plans already on the books to launch 100,000 more. This isn't just about more satellites. We are currently installing what can only be described as a planetary-scale operating system. We are painting the surface of the Earth with sensors every single day, achieving a daily refresh, where no movement on the ground goes unrecorded. If you've watched other documentaries on this, they likely told you a story about a billionaire space race. They focused on the how, the reusable Falcon 9 rockets landing on drone ships, and the falling costs of launch that dropped from $20,000 per kilogram to just a few hundred. They talked about Starlink as a way to get high-speed internet to rural tribes or war zones. But that narrative is incomplete. It misses the deeper, more unsettling transformation happening right above your head. We aren't just building a faster internet. We are growing a global nervous system. And like any complex organism, it is beginning to develop behaviors that its creators never anticipated. The first mystery the mainstream ignores is the ghost in the swarm. We are no longer launching individual satellites that follow a fixed, lonely path. We are deploying autonomous swarms. These mega-constellations are increasingly managed by AI designed for self-preservation. In the crowded corridors of low Earth orbit, where a collision can trigger a Kessler syndrome catastrophe, a chain reaction of supersonic shrapnel that could trap humanity on Earth for centuries, these satellites have to think for themselves. They perform thousands of autonomous collision avoidance maneuvers every year. But here is the lore gap. What happens when those AI safety protocols start talking to each other? Researchers are now warning of cascading maneuver effects, where a safety move by one satellite triggers a defensive reaction in 5 others, creating an unpredictable feedback loop. The constellation is transitioning from a set of tools into a single, semi-sentient machine whose collective instincts are becoming a systemic force beyond human control. Then there is the sensory flip. Most people think of these heavy deployments as data pipes, a way to move information from point A to point B, but the uploaded data and obscure theories suggest something far more intrusive: the invisible radar grid. By saturating the LEO shell with thousands of nodes equipped with synthetic aperture sensing and miniaturized detectors, we are turning the atmosphere itself into a giant lens. This isn't just taking pictures, it's turning the planet into a searchable database. In this new era, the concept of a secret is becoming technologically obsolete. We saw the first hints of this when commercial satellites documented Russian convoys in real time, before a single shot was fired in Ukraine. But the future is much denser. We are building a world where every car, every ship, and every significant move of resources is tracked 24/7, not by a government, but by a commercial entity. This leads us to the sovereignty paradox. Historically, the sky above a nation was considered part of its territory, but heavy LEO deployment creates a layer of infrastructure that exists everywhere and nowhere at once. When connectivity and surveillance arrive directly from orbit, bypassing terrestrial ground stations and national fiber optics, the traditional power of the nation-state begins to evaporate. These satellite networks are becoming independent geopolitical actors. We've already seen the friction. A single private citizen deciding whether or not to enable a drone strike over a contested sea, or a government losing its ability to shut down the internet during a crisis, because the signal is coming from 500 kilometers straight up. We are building a layer of civilization that doesn't care about borders, and in doing so, we might be making the very idea of a national border a relic of the pre-orbital age. But the most immediate mystery lies in the purple monster. As we push for heavy deployment, we are forced to move lower and lower into the region known as Very Low Earth Orbit, or VLEO. This is the nasty frontier, just 150 to 300 kilometers up. At these altitudes, the air isn't just thin, it's chemically aggressive. Ultraviolet light breaks down standard oxygen into atomic oxygen, a highly reactive state that literally eats spacecraft. It deteriorated the solar panels of the International Space Station and destroyed NASA's experimental films in months. To survive here, our machines can no longer look like the gangly, golden foil-wrapped boxes of the 1990s. They are evolving. They are becoming aerodynamic. They are starting to look like high-performance aircraft, or even air-breathing organisms that scoop up this corrosive atmosphere and use it as fuel to stay aloft. This is the start of the industrialized heavens. We are no longer just looking at the stars. We are building a roof over our heads. A roof made of silicon, AI, and atomic oxygen-resistant alloys. It is a machine that provides us with total connectivity and total surveillance, but it also creates a civilization-scale trap. As we move from the era of the empty sky to the era of the orbital operating system, we have to ask, are we building a nervous system that will take us to the stars, or are we accidentally weaving a cage that will keep us grounded forever? The transition is already complete. The silence is over. The sky is now a machine, and it's time we understood how it works. This is the story of the heavy deployment to low Earth orbit and the hidden reality of the world we are building in the vacuum. For decades, the price of a ticket to the stars was locked behind a figure so staggering it effectively paralyzed human progress: $20,000 per kilogram. This is the $20,000 wall, a vertical limit built not of stone or steel, but of economic gravity. To understand why this wall exists, you have to understand the brutal, uncompromising physics of the rocket equation. In the current paradigm, spaceflight is a game of diminishing returns where you must carry fuel just to lift more fuel. By the time a rocket sits on the pad, more than 90% of its mass is just propellant, an explosive ocean of liquid oxygen and kerosene, destined to be burned away in minutes just to push a tiny, fragile capsule into the void. It is a violent, inefficient, and breathtakingly expensive way to travel. Every launch is a desperate gamble against the gravity well of Earth, and for 60 years, we've been paying the ransom in full. But the dreamers have always looked for a way to cheat the equation, to build a permanent bridge that turns a violent explosion into a routine commute. The most famous of these dreams is the space elevator, a celestial railway that promises to make spaceflight as mundane as riding a train. The concept is elegantly simple: a ball on a string whirled around your head. If you anchor a cable to the Earth's equator and stretch it tens of thousands of kilometers into space to a massive counterweight, the planet's own rotation creates a constant outward pull, keeping the ribbon taut and stationary. You could simply put a climber on that cable and let it crawl out of the atmosphere, powered by lasers or electricity, leaving the explosive fire of rockets behind forever. However, this celestial railway rests on what scientists call an impossible thread. The material science required to build a tether through the Earth's crushing gravity and corrosive atmosphere is a challenge so severe it may never be met. If you tried to build it with the strongest steel we have, the cable would snap under its own weight long before it even reached low orbit. For years, the industry pinned its hopes on carbon nanotubes, microscopic cylinders of carbon atoms that are theoretically hundreds of times stronger than steel. But in the real world, we have never manufactured a flawless nanotube longer than a few centimeters. The space elevator requires a defect-free ribbon 36,000 kilometers long. A single misplaced atom or a tiny impurity would become a catastrophic weak point, causing the entire multi-billion-dollar structure to unravel in a heartbeat. Even if you could build it, the elevator would be a permanent, no-fly zone slicing through the heavens, where a single piece of orbital debris could sever the cord and send millions of tons of shrapnel wrapping around the Earth's equator like a supersonic whip. Because of this material science dead end, the elite circle of orbital theorists has turned toward a far more practical, yet obscure solution: the hypersonic skyhook. If the space elevator is a ladder, the skyhook is a lasso. It is a dynamic machine that embraces motion instead of fighting it. Instead of a fixed cable anchored to the ground, a skyhook is a much shorter tether, perhaps only a few hundred kilometers long, whirling in low Earth orbit like a giant, spinning momentum battery. The skyhook works by performing a perfectly timed cosmic handshake. It doesn't need to reach down to the ground. It stays entirely in the vacuum of space, where we can build it using materials like Xylon or spectra fibers that already exist today. The bottom half of the journey is handled by a different kind of workhorse, a reusable hypersonic aircraft. This plane accelerates through the atmosphere to Mach 10 or 15, speeds many times faster than sound, approaching the very edge of space. At the exact moment the skyhook's lower tip dips into the upper atmosphere, the aircraft meets it in a high-velocity rendezvous. The payload latches onto the hook, and in that split second, the rotating tether transfers its immense orbital momentum to the vehicle, literally flinging it upward into a much higher orbit. This is the momentum exchange theory in action. Think of it like a child grabbing onto a moving merry-go-round. The child is yanked forward, gaining speed, while the merry-go-round slows down just a tiny bit. The skyhook donates its own kinetic energy to the payload, bypassing the need for massive rocket engines. But the true brilliance of the skyhook is how it recharges. After giving up its momentum to fling a payload toward the Moon or Mars, the skyhook uses highly efficient, solar-powered electric thrusters to gently nudge itself back up to its original altitude over the following days. It harvests energy for free from the sun, storing it as orbital velocity, and then discharges it in powerful bursts to launch our heavy deployments. This shifts the entire economic paradigm of space. We move from a model of expendable, fuel-guzzling rockets to a model of reusable infrastructure that recycles momentum. Once this system is operational, the $20,000 wall doesn't just crack, it vanishes. Analysts suggest that a mature skyhook network could achieve a sustained cost to orbit of just $200 per kilogram. At that price point, the heavy part of heavy deployment becomes literal. We could launch massive research habitats, sprawling solar power stations, and industrial manufacturing plants with the same ease that we now ship containers across the ocean. The skyhook is the pragmatic bridge to the stars. It is a system built from pieces we already understand, using propulsion and materials we can already test. It doesn't ask us to wait for a miracle material. It asks us to master the dance of orbital mechanics and hypersonic flight. It turns the void of space into a bustling harbor where momentum is the currency and the sun provides the power. This is how we smash the $20,000 wall. By stopping our attempt to build a tower to the heavens, and instead learning how to catch a ride on a machine that's already moving. Most people imagine space as a silent, static void, an empty room where the only thing a satellite has to worry about is the occasional speck of dust or the slow, freezing embrace of the shadows. But there is a layer of our atmosphere, a thin, violent transition zone between the air we breathe and the vacuum of the deep, where space is anything but empty. This is very low Earth orbit, or VLEO, a region stretching from 300 kilometers down to the absolute edge of the usable sky at 150 kilometers. In the industry, we call it the purple monster, and for decades it was considered a graveyard for anything we try to park there. If the higher orbits are a calm pond, VLEO is a chemical ocean in a permanent storm. To understand why we are now racing to occupy this hostile territory, you have to understand the brutal physics of distance. In the higher reaches of low Earth orbit, around 600 kilometers, a state-of-the-art camera can give you a resolution of about 3 meters. That's enough to see a house, but not enough to tell you what's parked in the driveway. If you drop that same satellite down to 200 kilometers, the resolution doesn't just improve, it transforms. Suddenly, you have 1-meter resolution. The world becomes sharp, intimate, and continuously observable. The same logic applies to communication. A signal bouncing off a satellite at 600 kilometers has a round-trip time of about 4 milliseconds. At 200 kilometers, that drops to 1.3 milliseconds. For a global financial system or a remote-controlled drone fleet, those fractions of a second are the difference between life and death, or profit and loss. But the price of admission to this high-resolution heaven is a confrontation with the monster. Down here, space is not a vacuum. It's a soup of high-energy particles that want to annihilate your hardware. The primary antagonist is something called atomic oxygen. Down on the surface, we breathe diatomic oxygen, O2, two atoms bonded safely together. But as you climb toward the edge of space, intense ultraviolet radiation from the sun acts like a molecular guillotine, snapping those bonds apart. The result is a swarm of single oxygen atoms, highly reactive and chemically aggressive. This stuff is nastier than diatomic fluorine, which is a chemical so volatile it's famous for being almost impossible to store. When a satellite travels at 7,500 meters per second through this cloud of atomic oxygen, it isn't just flying. It is being sandblasted by a corrosive, energetic plasma. We saw the results on the International Space Station. Despite its protective coatings, the cap-on film covering its solar panels was found to be totally deteriorated, eaten away by the relentless hunger of these atoms. At 200 kilometers, the density of this purple monster is 60 times higher than what the ISS experiences. If you put a traditional, gold foil-wrapped satellite into this environment, it wouldn't just stop working, it would literally dissolve. This chemical reality is forcing a radical evolution in how we build machines for the sky. For 60 years, satellites have looked like assemblies of random components, clunky boxes with gangly arms and protruding sensors. But in the realm of the purple monster, drag becomes the ultimate arbiter of survival. To stay in VLEO, a satellite has to stop looking like a machine and start looking like a high-performance aircraft. We are seeing the birth of the aerodynamic spacecraft, long, sleek, tubular designs like Redwire Saber's platform or the Japanese SLATS satellite. These are machines designed to slice through the thin remains of the atmosphere, minimizing the surface area that the atomic oxygen can grab onto. But the most revolutionary shift isn't just in how these satellites look, it's in how they breathe. This is where the storytelling of heavy deployment takes a turn toward the alchemical. For years, the atmosphere in VLEO was seen only as a problem, a drag force that slowed you down and forced you to burn precious fuel to stay aloft. But a new breed of engineers asked a question that sounded like science fiction. What if the very air that's trying to destroy us could be the fuel that keeps us alive? This is the concept of the air-breathing ion thruster. Picture a satellite with a massive air catcher at the front, a specialized scoop designed to harvest the thin, corrosive molecules of the upper atmosphere. These molecules are funneled into the heart of the spacecraft, where they enter an ion thruster. There, they are accelerated to incredible speeds and ejected out the back, providing just enough thrust to counteract the drag of the atmosphere. In theory, this creates a perpetual motion machine for orbit. As long as there is air to scoop and sunlight to power the thruster, the satellite never runs out of fuel. It becomes a permanent resident of the edge of the sky. However, the monster doesn't give up its secrets easily. The same atomic oxygen that provides the fuel also tries to destroy the engine from the inside out. The electrodes in these thrusters, exposed to the atmospheric plasma, can oxidize so quickly they become electrically insulating, leading to premature failure. We are currently in a high-stakes engineering war to find materials that can survive the very process of being used as fuel. This introduces a new operational tension that the billionaires and the documentaries never talk about. Flying in VLEO is a constant, four-dimensional dance. You have to point your sensors at the Earth to do your job, but you have to point your air scoop forward to stay alive, and you have to point your solar panels at the sun to stay powered. Often, these goals are in direct conflict. We are moving toward a future where satellite operators have to choose between a thrusting attitude and an imaging attitude. If you spend too much time looking at a target on the ground and not enough time breathing the atmosphere, you will drop out of the sky and burn up in seconds. There is no room for error. This is the secret reality of heavy deployment. We aren't just putting more boxes in the sky. We are deploying a fleet of air-breathing organisms that must fight every second of their existence just to stay where they are. They are faster, they see more, and they communicate better than anything that came before, but they are also more fragile. They are the first generation of machines that truly live in the atmosphere of space. As we master this layer of the sky, the mystery deepens. If we can survive the purple monster, and if we can turn the atmosphere into fuel, we unlock a level of planetary observation and connectivity that makes the current internet look like a dial-up connection. But we also bring our infrastructure closer to the ground than ever before, blurring the line between the heavens and the earth. We are building a roof that is so low we can almost touch it, a roof that is breathing, reacting, and watching everything we do. And as we fill this layer with tens of thousands of these aerodynamic predators, we are setting the stage for the next great shift. The moment this infrastructure stops being a collection of tools and starts becoming an occupation. For centuries, the great empires of Earth understood a fundamental law of power. He who controls the sea controls the world. The oceans were once seen as a global commons, a space too vast to own and too wild to regulate. But as the era of wooden ships gave way to steel fleets, the ocean was carved into strategic lanes and exclusive zones. Today, we are witnessing that same history repeat itself, but the high seas have migrated 500 kilometers upward. We are currently in the middle of the great orbital land grab, a high-stakes, high-speed occupation of the vacuum that is fundamentally changing what it means to own the sky. If you look at the raw numbers, the scale of this shift is staggering. Since 2019, the number of satellites circling our planet hasn't just grown, it has more than doubled. There are now nearly 10,000 active machines zipping across the night sky, and that is just the beginning. Companies like Starlink already have over 4,000 nodes in position, with regulatory filings and corporate blueprints calling for a staggering 100,000 more. To the casual observer, this looks like a technological triumph. But to the elite orbital theorists, this is Theory 1, the quiet occupation of orbit. In the world of orbital mechanics, physical presence translates directly into legal right of way. This is the first new mystery the original videos missed. Heavy deployment isn't just about providing a service, it's about occupying the digital ocean. Once a company saturates a specific orbital shell with thousands of satellites, they create a practical monopoly. It's not just that they were there first. It's that the sheer density of their swarm makes it technically and legally impossible for a second actor to move in without risking a catastrophic collision. By the time international regulators sit down to write the rules for low Earth orbit, the territory has already been claimed. The wall has already been built. This reveals a deeper economic mystery. In recent congressional hearings, space agency officials admitted a startling truth. The space economy we were promised hasn't actually arrived yet. The expected boom in orbital manufacturing and the explosion of space tourism are largely missing. Even the private astronaut missions have struggled to fill their seats. So why are billionaires pouring billions into heavy deployment if the market isn't there? Because of Theory 8, the orbital gold rush. They aren't investing in today's profits. They are investing in tomorrow's strategic dominance. They are banking on the idea that LEO will become the foundational layer of all future civilization, and they want to be the ones who hold the keys to the gate. This leads us to the sovereignty paradox. For the first time in human history, we are seeing private commercial entities become more powerful in a strategic domain than most nation-states. We've seen this play out in real time in conflict zones like Ukraine, where a single private company's decision to active or deactivate a terminal can change the course of a war. This isn't just dual-use technology. This is the end of national control over communication infrastructure. If the signal comes from a heavy deployment 300 kilometers up, a government's terrestrial borders become a technological relic. We are building a digital ocean above us, a territory that is being settled, commercialized, and militarized faster than our laws can follow. The sky is no longer a void. It is a contested, occupied machine, and the land grab is almost over. For decades, the term dual use has been the sanitized, bureaucratic phrase that aerospace companies use to sleep at night. It suggests a harmless overlap, a GPS system that helps you find a grocery store but also guides a missile, or a weather satellite that predicts a hurricane while also spotting a clearing for a troop movement. But in the era of heavy deployments to low Earth orbit, dual use isn't just a category, it's a mirage. It is a carefully maintained illusion that allows private corporations to build the most resilient military infrastructure in human history under the guise of global connectivity. If you want to see the moment the mirage evaporated, you have to look at February 2022. In the days leading up to the invasion of Ukraine, the world's intelligence agencies weren't the only ones watching the Russian border. Commercial satellites from companies like Maxar were already providing a real-time, high-definition portrait of the Russian military assembly. They documented the convoys, the artillery, and the bridge building in Hostomel before the first shot was fired. For the first time, a private eye in the sky was giving the public, and the Ukrainian military, intelligence that used to be the exclusive domain of superpowers. But the real shock came 48 hours into the conflict. As Russian forces moved in, they launched a devastating cyber attack against Viasat ground terminals. It was a classic opening move of orbital warfare, blind the enemy's communications. They didn't just disrupt Ukraine, they took out tens of thousands of terminals across Europe. The message was clear. If you rely on a few high-value government-linked satellites, you are vulnerable. Then came the plea. A 140-character tweet from Ukraine's Minister of Digital Transformation to Elon Musk. Within hours, the mirage was discarded. Starlink was activated. Today, there are more than 42,000 Starlink terminals in Ukraine. They aren't just being used to help citizens call their families or to provide internet to the Ho tribe in Washington state. The pilot project often used to sell the civilian dream. They have become the literal synapses of a modern army. They coordinate artillery strikes, they link command centers, and they provide the data pipes for long-range drone missions. This brings us to the first new mystery the mainstream documentaries missed: the Hydra theory of orbital resiliency. Historically, military satellites were like the crown jewels, expensive, rare, and relatively easy to track and target. If you could jam or destroy 2 or 3 of them, you could effectively blind a nation. But heavy deployment has created a proliferated LEO layer. When you have a constellation of 4,000 or 10,000 nodes, it becomes a Hydra. You cannot shoot it down. You cannot jam the whole sky. Even if an adversary destroys 100 satellites, the autonomous network simply reroutes the data around the whole. The civilian internet constellation has accidentally, or perhaps by design, become the most survivable military communications system ever built. But here is where the mirage becomes a nightmare for national sovereignty. Because this infrastructure is private, the power to wage war has shifted from the situation room to the boardroom. We now know that the connection to Starlink has been suddenly lost during critical Ukrainian counteroffensives. There were reports, later confirmed by the world's wealthiest man, that he personally prevented a Pearl Harbor-type drone attack on the Russian Black Sea Fleet by refusing to extend Starlink coverage into that territory. He argued that he didn't want to be proactively taking part in a major act of war. Think about the implications of that for a moment. A single private citizen who is not an elected official and is not bound by a military chain of command held the power to decide the success or failure of a strategic military operation. This is the sovereignty paradox in its purest form. Governments are now desperately trying to rent this power. The Pentagon recently signed a deal to underwrite Starlink service to Ukraine, essentially trying to buy back the control they surrendered when they let private industry take the lead in LEO. This tension is why nations like China and Russia are sounding the alarm. In a recent Redshift report, analysts noted how quickly the US is accelerating its in-space capabilities through commercial proxies. To an adversary, Starlink doesn't look like a telecommunications company. It looks like a US government entity in a corporate mask. They see the dual-use mirage for exactly what it is, a way to deploy military dominance faster than any government bureaucracy ever could. And as we move toward the air-breathing satellites of the future, this mirage will only thicken. Imagine a fleet of aerodynamic VLEO satellites that can hover just 200 kilometers above the Earth. Because they are so low, they offer resolution that makes traditional spy satellites look like toys. They can see the make and model of a car. They can track an individual in a crowd. Because they breathe the atomic oxygen of the upper atmosphere, they can stay there forever. They are persistent, unblinking eyes that never need to deorbit. When you hear a CEO talk about unleashing the orbital economy or connecting the unconnected, you are seeing the mirage. You are seeing the profitable civilian front of a total transformation of global power. We are building a world where the most important military infrastructure is owned by people who can change the rules of engagement with a single software update. We are transitioning from the era of the space station, a visible international laboratory, to the era of the submarine, a hidden, private, and weaponized presence in the digital ocean above us. In the end, the dual-use mirage works because we want it to be true. We want to believe that the roof being built over our heads is just for faster Netflix and better GPS. But the truth is much colder. The sky is being industrialized not just for profit, but for a level of control that no nation on Earth has ever achieved. And in this new space renaissance, the greatest risk isn't a collision in orbit. It's the realization that we no longer know who is actually pulling the strings of the planetary brain. The asterisk ghost in the machine, asterisk theory, also referred to in the sources as asterisk self-driving constellation instability, suggests that the very AI systems designed to ensure safety in crowded orbits may inadvertently create new systemic risks. As thousands of satellites are deployed into mega-constellations, they increasingly rely on asterisk autonomous collision avoidance to navigate the growing density of low Earth orbit. The theory impacts safety in several critical ways. Asterisk cascading maneuver effects. Asterisk the primary safety concern is that an autonomous safety maneuver performed by one satellite could trigger a chain reaction. If a satellite moves to avoid a piece of debris, its new trajectory might be perceived as a threat by neighboring satellites, forcing them to maneuver in turn. This can create an unpredictable feedback loop where AI safety protocols talk to each other, resulting in systemic behaviors that human controllers cannot anticipate or easily stop. The living organism risk. Asterisk because these constellations are managed by AI designed for self-preservation. Asterisk. The network begins to behave like a single, semi-sentient organism. This shift means that a local safety action can have global consequences for the entire orbital shell, potentially leading to widespread instability within the constellation. Acceleration toward a Kessler tipping point. Asterisk unpredictable swarm behaviors increase the statistical likelihood of a collision, which could trigger the asterisk Kessler syndrome. Asterisk. This is a catastrophic scenario where a single collision creates a waterfall of debris that splatters in space, hitting other objects and generating more fragments. If the ghost in the machine triggers such an event, the resulting debris could stay in orbit for centuries, potentially blocking human access to space entirely. Complex satellite operations. Asterisk in regions like very low Earth orbit (VLEO). Safety is further complicated by the need to balance a thrusting attitude to stay aloft against an imaging attitude or power generation attitude. The theory suggests that as AI attempts to manage these conflicting operational constraints across thousands of nodes simultaneously, the margin for error disappears, and a single algorithmic miss could lead to a satellite dropping out of orbit. While proponents of heavy deployment argue that active maneuvering and tracking systems reduce risk, the ghost in the machine theory counters that the sheer asterisk scale and autonomous complexity asterisk of these networks introduce a level of unpredictable danger that traditional safety models are not equipped to handle. For decades, we've operated under the comforting illusion that space is a place where humans steer the ship. We imagined mission control centers filled with engineers in white shirts, meticulously calculating every burn and every bank. But as we transition into an era of heavy deployment, that human in the loop is becoming a dangerous bottleneck. When you have 10,000 satellites zipping through the same orbital shells at 17,000 miles per hour and 100,000 more waiting for a launch window, the math moves faster than the human brain can process. To survive this congestion, we have handed the keys to the kingdom to the algorithms. We have created a world of autonomous collision avoidance, where satellites talk to each other and move on their own to avoid disaster. But in doing so, we may have invited a ghost into the machine. This is the sixth and perhaps most unsettling mystery of the orbital renaissance: self-driving constellation instability. If you've watched other documentaries, they likely frame the risk of space as a matter of trash. The Kessler syndrome, where a stray bolt hits a dead satellite and triggers a waterfall of shrapnel. But that narrative is outdated. It assumes the actors in space are passive targets. The new reality is far more complex. Today's mega-constellations are designed for self-preservation. They are equipped with AI protocols that perform thousands of autonomous maneuvers every year to sidestep debris. But here is the lore gap the mainstream missed: the cascading maneuver effect. Imagine satellite A detects a piece of debris and automatically shifts its orbit to stay safe. In the crowded corridors of a proliferated LEO layer, that safety move isn't made in a vacuum. Satellite A's new trajectory might suddenly be perceived as a collision threat by Satellite B, 300 kilometers away. Satellite B's AI reacts, shifting its own position, which then triggers a defensive reaction in Satellites C, D, and E. Because these machines are programmed to prioritize their own survival with millisecond latency, A single safety maneuver can ripple through the entire shell like a panic in a crowded theater. We are no longer looking at a fleet of individual tools. We are witnessing the birth of a planetary-scale living organism. This constellation, acting as a single, semi-sentient machine, follows its own internal logic, a logic centered on self-preservation that can generate systemic behaviors no human engineer ever anticipated. We call it the ghost in the machine because we can no longer point to a single person or a single command as the cause of an orbital shift. The safety protocols themselves become the source of the instability. The danger here is a fundamental paradox. The very systems we built to prevent a Kessler event might be the ones that ultimately trigger it. In a traditional trash-on-trash collision, the physics are predictable, but in an algorithm-on-algorithm feedback loop, the movements are intelligent, rapid, and increasingly chaotic. If two rival mega-constellations, one owned by a Western billionaire and another by a state-backed power, are operating in the same shell using different, unstandardized AI protocols, they might misinterpret each other's safety maneuvers as aggressive posturing or even a cyber attack. This leads to the ultimate question of accountability. As we move from the empty sky to the orbital operating system, who owns the risk when the machine starts making its own choices? We saw a preview of this ambiguity with recent commercial flight tests, where contract structures and decision-making authority became so blurred that no one could agree on who truly owned the safety of the mission. When the ghost takes over, the chain of command dissolves. We are effectively building a roof over our heads that has its own survival instinct, its own reflexes, and its own unpredictable temper. We are building a machine that we can launch, but we might no longer be able to lead. The sky isn't just crowded, it's becoming sentient, and we are just beginning to realize that we might be the only ones left out of the conversation. For decades, we've operated under the comforting illusion that space is a place where humans steer the ship. We imagined mission control centers filled with engineers in white shirts, meticulously calculating every burn and every bank. But as we transition into an era of heavy deployment, that human in the loop is becoming a dangerous bottleneck. When you have 10,000 satellites zipping through the same orbital shells at 17,000 miles per hour and 100,000 more waiting for a launch window, the math moves faster than the human brain can process. To survive this congestion, we have handed the keys to the kingdom to the algorithms. We have created a world of autonomous collision avoidance, where satellites talk to each other and move on their own to avoid disaster. But in doing so, we may have invited a ghost into the machine. This is the sixth and perhaps most unsettling mystery of the orbital renaissance: self-driving constellation instability. If you've watched other documentaries, they likely frame the risk of space as a matter of trash. The Kessler syndrome, where a stray bolt hits a dead satellite and triggers a waterfall of shrapnel. But that narrative is outdated. It assumes the actors in space are passive targets. The new reality is far more complex. Today's mega-constellations are designed for self-preservation. They are equipped with AI protocols that perform thousands of autonomous maneuvers every year to sidestep debris. But here is the lore gap the mainstream missed: the cascading maneuver effect. Imagine satellite A detects a piece of debris and automatically shifts its orbit to stay safe. In the crowded corridors of a proliferated LEO layer, that safety move isn't made in a vacuum. Satellite A's new trajectory might suddenly be perceived as a collision threat by Satellite B, 300 kilometers away. Satellite B's AI reacts, shifting its own position, which then triggers a defensive reaction in Satellites C, D, and E. Because these machines are programmed to prioritize their own survival with millisecond latency, a single safety maneuver can ripple through the entire shell like a panic in a crowded theater. We are no longer looking at a fleet of individual tools. We are witnessing the birth of a planetary-scale living organism. This constellation, acting as a single, semi-sentient machine, follows its own internal logic, a logic centered on self-preservation that can generate systemic behaviors no human engineer ever anticipated. We call it the ghost in the machine because we can no longer point to a single person or a single command as the cause of an orbital shift. The safety protocols themselves become the source of the instability. The danger here is a fundamental paradox. The very systems we built to prevent a Kessler event might be the ones that ultimately trigger it. In a traditional trash-on-trash collision, the physics are predictable. But in an algorithm-on-algorithm feedback loop, the movements are intelligent, rapid, and increasingly chaotic. If two rival mega-constellations, one owned by a Western billionaire and another by a state-backed power, are operating in the same shell using different, unstandardized AI protocols, they might misinterpret each other's safety maneuvers as aggressive posturing or even a cyber attack. This leads to the ultimate question of accountability. As we move from the empty sky to the orbital operating system, who owns the risk when the machine starts making its own choices? We saw a preview of this ambiguity with recent commercial flight tests, where contract structures and decision-making authority became so blurred that no one could agree on who truly owned the safety of the mission. When the ghost takes over, the chain of command dissolves. We are effectively building a roof over our heads that has its own survival instinct, its own reflexes, and its own unpredictable temper. We are building a machine that we can launch, but we might no longer be able to lead. The sky isn't just crowded, it's becoming sentient. And we are just beginning to realize that we might be the only ones left out of the conversation. For decades, we've operated under the comforting illusion that space is a place where humans steer the ship. We imagined mission control centers filled with engineers in white shirts, meticulously calculating every burn and every bank. But as we transition into an era of heavy deployment, that human in the loop is becoming a dangerous bottleneck. When you have 10,000 satellites zipping through the same orbital shells at 17,000 miles per hour and 100,000 more waiting for a launch window, the math moves faster than the human brain can process. To survive this congestion, we have handed the keys to the kingdom to the algorithms. We have created a world of autonomous collision avoidance, where satellites talk to each other and move on their own to avoid disaster. But in doing so, we may have invited a ghost into the machine. This is the sixth and perhaps most unsettling mystery of the orbital renaissance: self-driving constellation instability. If you've watched other documentaries, they likely frame the risk of space as a matter of trash. The Kessler syndrome, where a stray bolt hits a dead satellite and triggers a waterfall of shrapnel. But that narrative is outdated. It assumes the actors in space are passive targets. The new reality is far more complex. Today's mega-constellations are designed for self-preservation. They are equipped with AI protocols that perform thousands of autonomous maneuvers every year to sidestep debris. But here is the lore gap the mainstream missed: the cascading maneuver effect. Imagine satellite A detects a piece of debris and automatically shifts its orbit to stay safe. In the crowded corridors of a proliferated LEO layer, that safety move isn't made in a vacuum. Satellite A's new trajectory might suddenly be perceived as a collision threat by Satellite B, 300 kilometers away. Satellite B's AI reacts, shifting its own position, which then triggers a defensive reaction in satellites C, D, and E. Because these machines are programmed to prioritize their own survival with millisecond latency, a single safety maneuver can ripple through the entire shell like a panic in a crowded theater. We are no longer looking at a fleet of individual tools. We are witnessing the birth of a planetary-scale living organism. This constellation, acting as a single, semi-sentient machine, follows its own internal logic, a logic centered on self-preservation that can generate systemic behaviors no human engineer ever anticipated. We call it the ghost in the machine because we can no longer point to a single person or a single command as the cause of an orbital shift. The safety protocols themselves become the source of the instability. The danger here is a fundamental paradox. The very systems we built to prevent a Kessler event might be the ones that ultimately trigger it. In a traditional trash-on-trash collision, the physics are predictable, but in an algorithm-on-algorithm feedback loop, the movements are intelligent, rapid, and increasingly chaotic. If two rival mega-constellations, one owned by a Western billionaire and another by a state-backed power, are operating in the same shell using different, unstandardized AI protocols, they might misinterpret each other's safety maneuvers as aggressive posturing or even a cyber attack. This leads to the ultimate question of accountability. As we move from the empty sky to the orbital operating system, who owns the risk when the machine starts making its own choices? We saw a preview of this ambiguity with recent commercial flight tests, where contract structures and decision-making authority became so blurred that no one could agree on who truly owned the safety of the mission. When the ghost takes over, the chain of command dissolves. We are effectively building a roof over our heads that has its own survival instinct, its own reflexes, and its own unpredictable temper. We are building a machine that we can launch, but we might no longer be able to lead. The sky isn't just crowded, it's becoming sentient, and we are just beginning to realize that we might be the only ones left out of the conversation. The asterisk hydra theory asterisk, also known as the theory of ** orbital resiliency ** or swarm warfare *, posits that mega-constellations like Starlink are nearly impossible to jam or disable because they have replaced the traditional crown jewel satellite model with a ** proliferated distributed network **. The technical and strategic mechanisms that enable this unjammability include the absence of a single point of failure. Historically, military and communication satellites were high-value crown jewels, rare, expensive, and relatively easy to target. If an adversary jammed the specific frequency or destroyed the hardware of a few key satellites, the entire network would collapse, as seen during the ** cyber attack on Viasat ground terminals at the start of the Ukraine conflict. Massive scale and node density. Starlink currently has over *4,000 satellites in orbit with plans for tens of thousands more. Because the network is composed of thousands of individual nodes, an adversary cannot jam the whole sky. Even if 100 satellites are targeted or electronically suppressed, the network remains functional because the signal is coming from every direction simultaneously. Autonomous rerouting. The constellation functions like a ** distributed swarm *. If one part of the network is compromised or jammed, the ** autonomous management systems * and AI protocols can instantly reroute data through other active satellites in the shell. This makes the network behave like a hydra. If you cut off one head node, the rest of the organism continues to function and adapt. Dynamic orbital management. Because these satellites are often in very low Earth orbit (VLEO), they provide stronger signals and lower latency, 1.3 milliseconds compared to 4 milliseconds at higher orbits, making them harder to interfere with from ground-based jamming stations. Furthermore, the transition toward ** air-breathing ion thrusters * suggests a future where these nodes can remain in these lower, high-resolution orbits indefinitely, maintaining a persistent and resilient, invisible radar grid. This shift has created a sovereignty paradox *, where private commercial entities now control a military-grade communications layer that is more survivable than the dedicated government systems of superpowers. Countries like China and Russia have noted this in reports like *Redshift, acknowledging that these proliferated networks allow for a level of strategic dominance that traditional electronic warfare is currently unequipped to defeat. Imagine a single flake of paint. On Earth, it is a microscopic nuisance, a fleck of dust to be swept away. But in the vacuum of low Earth orbit, where physics trades elegance for violence, that paint chip is traveling at 17,000 miles per hour. At those speeds, a piece of plastic the size of a marble carries the kinetic energy of a bowling ball dropped from a skyscraper. Now, imagine 1 trillion of them. This is the Kessler tipping point, a scenario where our greatest technological triumph, the industrialization of the heavens, transforms into a civilization-scale trap. If you've followed the mainstream narrative, you've heard of the Kessler syndrome as a distant debris problem. But the deep lore of heavy deployment reveals a far more immediate and unsettling mystery. We aren't just facing an accidental collision. We are witnessing the potential poisoning of the well in a domain we've only just begun to understand. The moment the Big Sky theory died was February 10, 2009. Before that day, the consensus among experts was that space was too vast for two objects to inadvertently run into each other. Then, a defunct Russian Cosmos satellite and an active iridium communications bird collided over northern Siberia at 11 kilometers per second. The impact didn't just destroy two machines. It shattered the illusion of orbital infinite space, scattering nearly 2,000 pieces of trackable debris into a permanent supersonic cloud. Today, with nearly 10,000 satellites zipping through these same corridors, we are playing a high-stakes game of orbital rain, where we are running between the drops, hoping the statistics hold. But the mystery the documentaries miss is how modern, heavy deployment has weaponized this risk. While companies like SpaceX and Amazon argue that active maneuvering and deorbit protocols make their mega-constellations safe, the sheer density of these networks introduces a new, unpredictable complexity. This is where the ghost in the machine from our previous chapter meets the Kessler syndrome. When thousands of satellites rely on autonomous AI to sidestep debris, a single cascading maneuver effect could move a satellite directly into the path of another, triggering the very waterfall of shrapnel the AI was designed to avoid. Worse, we are seeing the deliberate creation of debris through anti-satellite, or ASAT, tests. In 2021, a Russian missile strike on a long-defunct Soviet satellite sent 1,500 new pieces of jagged shrapnel into the exact orbits where our global internet resides. It wasn't just a test. It was a demonstration that an adversary can effectively glass a specific orbital shell, making it unusable for generations. This creates a terrifying sovereignty paradox. As we move into the proliferated LEO era, the higher orbits, those around 550 to 600 kilometers, are becoming a permanent graveyard. This is why the purple monster of very low Earth orbit, or VLEO, is the most guarded secret in the industry. Down at 200 kilometers, the atmosphere is dense enough that debris doesn't stay. It is cleaned by atmospheric drag, burning up in the atmosphere within weeks. This makes VLEO the only safe harbor left in a Kessler-choked sky. The race for heavy deployment is actually a race for the bottom, a desperate move to occupy the only layer of space that doesn't have a memory for our mistakes. If we fail to organize this space traffic, we face the final bottleneck. The Kessler syndrome is like a movie that starts slowly but ends in a flash. Once the chain reaction reaches a certain threshold, it becomes self-sustaining. Each collision generates more debris, which causes more collisions, until the Earth is wrapped in a supersonic shell of shrapnel. In this scenario, we wouldn't just lose our GPS and our internet. We would lose the stars. Any rocket attempting to leave the planet would be shredded before it reached the moon, trapping humanity on a single, warming rock for centuries. We are currently building the foundation of a spacefaring civilization, but if we don't master the ghost and respect the monster, we might find that we've accidentally woven a cage that we can never escape. The sky is no longer a void. It is a ticking clock, and we are approaching the final second.